So my name is Michael Birrer. I'm professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the director of medical gynecologic oncology at Massachusetts General Hospital. The topic this morning is clinical trials. What are they and how are they designed? We view, most of the clinicians and even patients view clinical trials as really a journey, and that's a journey to find the right person for the right trial. The outline for this morning's presentation is really the 5 W's. What is a clinical trial? Who participates? Where do they take place? When should one participate? And why should one participate? Now, what a clinical trial is defined different ways, and we usually rely on what the National Institutes of Health presents. And they have actually 3 different descriptions for a clinical trial. The first one is patient-oriented research. Obviously, this is a clinical trial that involves humans, clinical materials, medical interventions, tissues such as blood and ascites. The second type of clinical trial is an epidemiologic study or behavioral study. This is a little bit different. We examine the frequency or prevalence of a particular disease in a population and factors that affect people's health in relationship to that disease. And then finally, the NIH also defines what's called outcomes research and health services research. And this is actually a newer area of clinical trials. And its goal is to really find the most effective and efficient type of intervention. The clinical trial we're talking about this morning will be the first one, which is patient-oriented research. And again, I emphasize this is conducted with humans, with patients, and clinical materials and clinical interventions. So these types of clinical trials come in several flavors, if you will. The first type is a very small study called an early phase or phase 1 trial, which is looking at essentially whether the drug can be given safely and what the toxicities are. Once that study is conducted and a safe dose has been determined, the trials usually move on to what's known as a phase 2 trial, which is conducted with a larger number of patients in a particular tumor type. And the goal on phase 2 trials is actually to demonstrate whether the drug is effective at affecting or improving the particular disease that's being studied. So for cancer, we would be looking at whether the drug can actually shrink the tumor or prolong a patient's disease-free interval or overall survival. The third phase, assuming that the drug looks effective, the phase 3 trial is a much larger trial that's involving literally hundreds, potentially even 1,000 or 2,000 patients, where the new drug that has now been found to have effectiveness is compared to the standard of care. These are usually the types of trials that the regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration will require to approve a drug for general use. And then finally, a less common discussed phase trial is the phase 4 trial, which actually is conducted after the drug is approved by the FDA. And the purpose of a phase 4 trial is to essentially accumulate very large amounts of experience with a particular drug to get more information about safety and toxicity. This is called a phase 4 trial. Now let me just point out that many drugs enter this process. So my own personal experiences, I've had probably hundreds of trials come through in my career of drugs in the early phase 1 or phase 2 portion of this journey. Unfortunately, as you march along, many drugs begin to drop out and fail because A, they're too toxic, B, they're not effective, or C, they're effective, but when they go to that critical phase 3 trial, they're not proven to be as good or even better than standard of care. So this is a long, time-consuming, quite frankly, expensive proposition to take a drug from the laboratory all the way through to approval by the FDA. Now let's go back to the phase 1 trial I mentioned before. So this purpose of the phase 1 trial is to find a safe dose. You do not want to be using a drug in an unsafe way in a patient population. So these trials are designed in an incremental fashion. The drug is given to a few patients at a low dose. If it appears safe, it's then given at a higher dose, and this process is repeated with very careful monitoring of patients and scoring of toxicities. And this purpose is to find what's called the maximum tolerated dose. This is the dose that can be given, the largest dose that can be given in a safe fashion. During this process, there is an accumulated understanding of the types of toxicities that the drug demonstrates. As you probably know, many drugs have a huge spectrum of toxicities. Some affect the skin, some will affect the GI tract, some will affect the bone marrow. And so during this phase 1 trial, one is accumulating a understanding of this toxicity spectrum for the particular drug at hand. The phase 2 trial, as I mentioned before, is then to take that maximum tolerated dose and give it to a larger number of patients to, again, accumulate more safety information, but more importantly, to find out whether this drug at the maximum tolerated dose can demonstrate some efficacy for the tumor at hand. So I'd like to emphasize the phase 1 trial is safety can actually be given to a broad spectrum of patients, cancer patients. It doesn't have to be given to a single type of cancer patient. So a lung cancer, a ovarian cancer patient, a colon cancer patient may go on a phase 1 trial. When you get to a phase 2, they tend to be much more narrow. You take the maximum tolerated dose and you design the phase 2 to give it to 20 or 40 ovarian cancer patients. During that time, again, patients are carefully followed for the development of toxicity and side effects, but more importantly, the tumor itself is measured in a very careful way to look for the effect of the drug on the tumor. This is called response. And they are actually measured on the CT scans to look for shrinkage, which would be called a partial response, or if it disappears completely, a complete response, or to measure the tumor to make sure that it's not growing. And if the tumor is actually growing while the patient's on trial, they then come off trial because the particular agent is not benefiting them. Once this is conducted and we show an agent has demonstrated efficacy, meaning that it has a response rate that looks interesting, intriguing, and justifies moving on to a definitive trial, then it's moved into that phase 3 trial that I talked about before. Phase 3 trials are very large trials, 1,000 patients. I've been involved on phase 3 trials that included 4,000 ovarian cancer patients. So these are very large scale, almost without exception, multi-center trials, which are done across the United States and sometimes and frequently in Europe. So they're both domestic and international. One of the important components of a phase 3 trial is randomization. So you're asking the question, is the new drug more effective than the standard of care? And this necessitates that when patients are entered onto the trial, that they get assigned randomly to one of the two arms, either the standard of care or the new drug. This is important to know because many times patients are bothered by the fact that they're not going to get the new drug. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration before signing consent and going on the trial. The flip side is that phase 3 trials are dealing with drugs that are known to be safe and appear to be efficacious. So as opposed to early drug trials where you're really dealing with drugs that have not been tested much. So all of these trials have pluses and minuses. In this particular case, there is a randomization. There are variations of this. More recently, trials have been designed that have that phase 2 component, looking for efficacy, and it's built right into a phase 3 type trial design. So patients can be entered onto the phase 2. If the drug looks active, that whole trial design is then expanded into a phase 3 trial, and those patients who have been on the phase 2 and for which the drug is working, they can remain on that trial and participate in the phase 3 component. These are more recent alterations in drug design that the FDA has approved because it accelerates our ability to move drugs quickly to approval. One of the aspects of phase 3 trials that, and frankly phase 1 and phase 2, but particularly phase 3 trials that patients should appreciate, is that there are what's called correlative studies. These are going to involve the obtaining of tissues from the patient, blood, potentially other fluids, even urine, but also occasionally biopsies of the tumor. And so the patient needs to be aware that these are built into the trial. The purpose of this is to bank these materials so that at some future date, experiments can be done on that to identify really critical biomarkers to tell us, to tell the physicians, to tell the doctors and the patients who might benefit most from this particular drug. So correlative studies are very important, and you'll see a lot of those built into phase 3 trials. The other important aspect of all of these trials, you probably know, but in particular phase 3 trials, is that none of these trials can go forward unless they have been carefully designed and, more importantly, reviewed by what's called an IRB, Institutional Review Board. These boards are tasked with making sure that the trial is designed well, that patient safety is protected, and that there is what's known as a consent form that informs the patient of all aspects of the trial, including safety issues, drug side effects, potential benefits from the trial. That's what's necessary for informed consent. Now, the protocol itself is a fairly large document, but it's an important document, and all the components of the trial are within the protocol document. That would include reasons for conducting the trial. Why is the physician doing this? What is important about this particular drug, and why is it being tested? It will also very specifically delineate who is eligible to go on the trial and who is not eligible. These are called inclusion and exclusion criteria. It will also have the total number of patients needed for the trial. As I said before, phase 1 trials, you may have as few as 10 to 20 patients. Phase 2 trials, 20 to 40. And then as you get to phase 3, many, many, many more patients. That's all delineated in the protocol. The protocol document will also very specifically outline the tests that the patient has to undergo. It will also point out all the procedures, the specific drugs, and their dosages. That's obviously the meat of the trial, and that's what's important for the patient to know. It'll also very specifically discuss how long the trial is. Is this a 1-year trial? Is it a 2-year trial? I've had trials which are effectively open until all the data is collected. And then finally, it will very carefully list all the information that will be obtained from the patients. Will this be simply tumor response? Will it be a list of toxicities, or is the trial going to ask questions about family history, sexual behavior? All of these have to be listed for the patient to know and understand. It's important to know that what we call the cast of characters in the clinical trial. So the first and potentially most important one is the principal investigator. Well, that's the individual who usually develops the concept of the trial, will write the protocol. If an industry is sponsoring the trial, industry is going to play a role in the way the trial is written and designed, and so they will collaborate with the PI. Ultimately, the principal investigator is responsible for the conduct of the trial, all the collection of the data, the processing of the data, making sure that it's done according to ethical standards, and then finally, the PI, the principal investigator, will interact with the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, to make sure that the protocol goes through approval. PIs themselves can't do all the work, and so frequently there are co-investigators involved in these types of protocols. These would be individuals who would actually see the patients and then score the toxicities, write the orders for the drugs, obtain the consent for the individual patients, and they would work with the PI and ultimately the research nurse to implement the trial. Research nurse is actually critically important for the conduct of clinical trials. The research nurse usually is intimately involved and knowledgeable for all of the patients on trial at that particular institution. The research nurse is involved in helping to grade the toxicities along with the co-investigators and the PI. And the research nurse is involved in supervising a whole cast of other individuals called clinical research coordinators or clinical research associates who handle all of the data collection, all of the forms that score all the toxicities and the tumor response. All that information has to be handled properly for it to be reliable. That's done by CRCs and CRAs under the supervision of the research nurse, who's under the supervision of the principal investigator. Another component for the clinical research coordinators, other than collecting that data, is that they make sure that all of those tissue samples I talked about before are collected in a proper fashion, processed appropriately, and they get to the appropriate biobanks or labs where they are stored or analyzed. This is critically important. If you're drawing blood and obtaining tissues from patients but not processing it well, it can't be used in a rational fashion, and you have done a disservice to the patient. Okay, so then the question becomes, now that I've described the portfolio of trials, from a patient standpoint, what's the right fit for a particular trial? So that gets us to the second W, who participates. So there are guidelines on this, as I said before, which is every protocol or trial will have inclusion and exclusion criteria. And these are important. And when patients begin to talk with doctors about trials, the first thing that should come up, and if it doesn't, patients should ask about this: am I included or excluded in that particular trial? Because every trial will have very specific criteria. And talking about a trial that a patient is excluded from is a frustrating and futile exercise. Once it's been established that a particular patient fits the inclusion criteria, the second important issue is to remember that there is a washout period to all trials. What do I mean by washout? If a patient has been on a treatment prior to the trial, whether that be another trial or standard of care, chemotherapy, almost all trials will require a 4-week period to wash out all of those drugs. Why is this? Well, because one doesn't want a patient going onto a trial, particularly if it's a safety trial, meaning we don't quite know how this drug works, with another drug already in their bloodstream. This could potentially could yield a unknown toxicity, which would not be helpful for the patient, and it would also obscure and confuse the trial because we're trying to identify what the toxicity is of the drug at hand. And then finally, in order to fit a trial, usually they require certain laboratory results and imaging tests. You'll frequently hear that the trial requires evaluable disease. What does that mean? That means that the disease can actually be measured on a CT scan, measured in literally a ruler type way, 2 centimeters, 1 centimeter. And the reason why this is important is because, again, many of these trials are testing whether a drug is efficacious. If you can't identify the tumor, you're not going to be able to judge that. So imaging tests and lab tests are going to be important to find out eligibility criteria. Now, there are other important issues that the patient should consider other than just eligibility. As I said before, some trials have a randomization. You may not get the experimental drug, you may get standard of care, and that is a concern to some patients, particularly if the experimental drug has received a lot of publicity and patients are excited about it. There may be a 50-50 chance of not getting that. So there is a component of some trials that you should look for called crossover. So some trials have a randomization to control arm, standard of care versus experimental drug. But it allows for patients on the standard of care arm to cross over to the experimental arm at the time of progression, meaning that everybody gets the drug. This is very attractive to some patients, and that's important to look for. One should pay attention to the schedule. The phase 1, phase 2 trials tend to be quite complex. So even though you may be taking the drug only once every 3 weeks, they may expect you to be coming in every day for the first week for what's called pharmacokinetic or pharmacodynamic biomarkers. So the schedule is important. The kind of drug is important. Is this taken by mouth or is it an infusion? That again gets back to convenience. Lots of patients like oral drugs. Easy, take a pill. Infusions get a little more complicated. On the other hand, some diseases cause a lot of GI distress, and taking oral pills is a problem. So again, what the right fit is depends a lot upon the patient and the components of the trial. And then finally, discuss at length with your doctor the potential side effects. If this is a early phase trial, not too much may be known about it. If it's a phase 2 or phase 3, more may be known, and it may be that the side effects simply don't fit your particular medical condition at this time. Okay, where do trials take place? Well, normally in a cancer center. And they come in different flavors. There are small community cancer centers where clinical trials may be a little more simple. And then there are large academic cancer centers like the one we have here at Mass General, where the portfolio is huge. And we may have at any one time 300, 400, 500 trials open that patients can select from. The actual performance of the trial is done within an infusion center. This is a center that is dedicated to infusing chemotherapy, staffed by wonderful nurses and nurse practitioners who do this full-time and are very knowledgeable about it. The phase 1 trials, because they're so complex, will frequently be put in their own unit. And here at Mass General, we have the Birrer Center, which is dedicated to complex phase 1 trials. And that's because all of those pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies that I've talked about require very strict time constraints. And so the people who staff the phase 1 unit know about that. And then finally, oral drugs, well, it's being given at home. We don't usually have patients come in on a daily basis to take their oral drugs on trial. But one of the components of an oral drug protocol will be pill counting. So patients will get very specific numbers of pills. Then they will be asked to bring their bottle in at the end, at the end of the cycle, and all of the pills left will be counted to make sure that nothing's been missed, because that's very important. Patient compliance on an oral trial is very, very important. When should one participate? Very important, and it varies, depends on the scenario and what's available. We have trials for upfront treatment of ovarian cancer. These trials are for patients who are just newly diagnosed. So patients should consider those even at that point in the natural history of their disease. Certainly in recurrence, the portfolio for trials for recurrence of ovarian cancer is quite large. And if they're written carefully, they're going to be as good as standard of care, potentially better. They should be considered at that point. And then more recently, there's been a lot of interest in maintenance therapies. Once patients are treated with standard of care, the tumor disappears. Can they go on a trial that is designed to try to keep that tumor from coming back? And these have become very popular in the last 4 or 5 years. Remember, eligibility, inclusion and exclusion. Most trials will limit the number of prior lines. So as you receive more and more treatment for your tumor, your eligibility for trials will drop, because most trials will restrict it to 4 or less, maybe even 3 or less, and occasionally even 2 prior lines or less. So please keep that in mind. The other final point I would make is some trials will contain drugs that you may have gotten as standard of care. And frequently when that is the case, the trial will exclude patients who have had those drugs. So again, I think as you go through the natural history of your disease and standard of care options are being discussed, clinical trials should be discussed in parallel with that so you can weigh all of these issues. And finally, we're at our last W, why should one participate? And this is a very important question because again, these are effectively clinical trials. They are on one level experimental. And so there's several reasons I would put forward to consider participation in a clinical trial. First of all, there's the global paying it forward issue, which is that these trials, well-designed trials, are going to ask an important question. And that question, if answered properly, will move the entire field forward so the next generation of patients will be able to benefit from a new drug or a new procedure or a new process. That's how the entire field moves forward. But in addition to that, if the trial is designed carefully, there should be a therapeutic gain or potential therapeutic gain specifically for the patient. And that is, in fact, the issue to contemplate for the patient. The potential therapeutic gain for early drug trials may be less because these are experimental drugs than a phase 3 trial. But the phase 3 trial may have a placebo control or a randomization, so you may not get it. Have to weigh these. And that weighing process is actually has a term called equipoise, where the patient needs to, in conjunction with his or her physician, weigh the risks, weigh the potential benefits, and superimpose that on the total benefit for the entire field. These are important discussions which should take place on a regular basis between a patient and their physician. And with that, I thank you. Well, this is it's sort of a hot topic, or at least a controversial topic. And the science behind it is that about 70% of ovarian cancer tumors express the estrogen receptor. So that's so for some physicians, that's worrisome, that giving hormone replacement therapy might in some way increase the risk for recurrence or drive the tumor. Having said that, I think what's important to acknowledge that even though 70% of the tumors have the estrogen receptor, the signaling from the estrogen receptor would appear to be blocked or absent. So we generally don't view ovarian cancer like breast cancer, as it being hormonally responsive. So some physicians look at it in that way, and they feel comfortable giving hormones. So I think at this point it still remains somewhat controversial. I tend not to do it. Yeah, so it's a great question. So triple MTs, also known as carcinosarcomas, are rare tumors. They come from essentially any part of what's called the Mullerian system. Could be ovary, endometrium, or even fallopian tube. And sadly, because it's a rare tumor, we don't really know much about them, and we don't know much about what they respond to. They are frequently put into ovarian trials and put into endometrial trials. But of course, since they're a rare tumor, there's only a few of them. So our knowledge on them is just shockingly poor. The treatments that this particular patient's got, I would say, would be standard of care. And the data would suggest that patients aren't going to respond as well as sort of run-of-the-mill ovarian cancer or run-of-the-mill endometrial cancer. The research we're doing, which has been actually helped by a very large fundraising effort for this rare tumor, is to understand the molecular features of this tumor and then relatively quickly translate that into clinical trials. So sadly, I would say right now, I know of no carcinosarcoma specific trial, but I'm hoping within 6 months to a year, we'll have some rationally designed trials for these patients and a network of institutions across the United States which can open these trials. So yeah, I would say in the big picture that when patients are diagnosed with ovarian cancer, available clinical trials should be discussed even up front. And we do have upfront trials here. And some of these are very large international trials, so they're open at multiple institutions. So that should be discussed. Now, the caveat here is, clear cell cancers of the ovary are also a rare tumor. And that, although I can't quote it, sometimes the trials would only be for serous tumors, which are more common, and clear cells may be excluded. Second, after the staging of this patient had stage 1C. I know of no early stage, that's considered an early stage tumor. I know of no upfront early stage ovarian cancer clinical trials throughout the world. So that may be one of the reasons this was not discussed. The good news is it's an early stage tumor as opposed to a late stage tumor. Now, clear cells are interesting tumors in that we've done some research on this. We think of clear cell tumors as a completely different tumor from the rest of ovarian cancer. Its molecular features are very different. And probably in the future, treating them like run-of-the-mill ovarian cancer will change. We're not there yet. So I actually think, based on the staging and then what she was offered, was appropriate standard of care.
Okay, so I think that...
The other elements that were brought up there, though, that bothers me a little bit is, I think she brought up the issue of risk of recurrence, natural history of this disease. Those are issues that should be discussed with the patient, certainly, if not at the initial diagnosis or after the staging procedure, during those 6 cycles of chemo. Patients want to know that this information is known and should be shared with patients. So that, I've always said a knowledgeable patient is the best partner a physician can have. So although we certainly spend a lot of time talking with patients and conducting research for advanced stage tumors and recurrent tumors, the holy grail for many of my ovarian cancer patients is always the question about, is there an early detection assay for ovarian cancer? And I understand that it's it's oncologic common sense that if we can identify this tumor early enough and do surgery or something even more limited and get rid of it, that's ideal. So the bad news is there is no early detection assay that's available. The good news is there really is cutting edge research that's moving, I think, relatively fast, that has a lot of promise to produce a test that will be accurate enough to at least identify some tumors, some ovarian cancers in early stage, which would be curable by surgery. And this involves essentially getting protein biomarkers in the blood that are better than CA-125, which we know by itself is not a good early detection assay. It shouldn't be used that way. You will sometimes see ladies getting it in the general population, not helpful. But it's likely that there are other proteins in the blood that may be more accurate or can be used in combination to design a blood-based assay for early detection. And then finally, recently, work done from Hopkins, and now we're doing some up here between Mass General and the Broad Institute across the river. We're beginning to look at the possibility that some of these tumors shed cells and DNA down the fallopian tube that end up in around the cervix area in the vagina, that high throughput sequencing, some of this really next-gen type sequencing, and potentially even proteomics can identify cancer-specific proteins. That also may be an interesting and effective early detection assay. So between those two, I remain very optimistic. Now, another important area that there's a lot of discussion about, which frankly, sadly, was not a topic 15 years ago, is the quality of life of our patients with ovarian cancer, particularly the quality of life of long-term survivors. And I say sadly because I think 15, 20 years ago, our patients didn't live that long. They are now. And so it becomes an issue, it's becoming an important issue. What's their quality of life? What's the quality of life of patients who have lived 10 years or longer with ovarian cancer? Because we have them. And how is that impacted based upon the therapies we give them? So these are very hot topics, and I think in the long run what you're going to see is it's going to be a factor that it will help guide our therapies early in the course of the disease. So for instance, we use a lot of Taxol. And I often say that when you give carboplatin and Taxol, the Taxol is the bugaboo because it's the one that gives neuropathy, it's the one for the hair loss, the muscle aches and pains. Will we be, as we get more effective therapies, and we know that those kinds of side effects cause long-term side effects and affect the quality of life, will we be moving away from Taxol, potentially to other agents that we can substitute, which will not only promote survival of patients, but improve quality of life. So these things are going to become very important. Maintenance therapy is a hot issue. So the good news about maintenance therapy with either a PARP inhibitor or bevacizumab or Avastin is that it can prolong that progression-free survival. What do I mean by that? It can delay the tumor from coming back. That's a positive for quality of life because if the tumor's not there, patients feel better. The downside is you're still taking something. So you might get some low-grade nausea from the PARP inhibitor, or you might have hypertension from the bevacizumab. So we need to balance these. And the issue that we're balancing most of the time is quality of life. So we'll see more of that, and that'll become an important issue.